You think cheap meals meant sacrificing flavor and love? Think again. Black mothers in the 1960s and 70s stretched pennies into feasts so satisfying their families never felt poor at the table. Flour sacks, saved for biscuits and bread, were the kind of staple every African-American family guarded during the Great Depression because they knew nothing stretched a meal like flour. Those sacks sat in corners of kitchens, tied tight to keep bugs out, holding the simple ingredient that kept families going when choices were slim. Flour became biscuits on cold mornings, skillet bread for dinner, dumplings dropped into broth, and roux that thickened pots meant to last more than one night. Kids watched their mothers scoop flour with practiced hands, never truly measuring yet always getting it right. Even the sacks themselves were reused, turned into towels, aprons, or patches. When clothing wore thin flour meant predictability, warmth, and something filling on the table. It was survival disguised as something ordinary. Ash-cooked sweet potatoes were a simple yet unforgettable treat. Whole sweet potatoes were nestled directly into the hot ashes of a wood-burning fireplace or outdoor fire pit, slowly roasting until their skins blackened and their insides caramelized. The result was a soft, smoky sweetness that needed no sugar or butter to shine. In African-American households, especially in rural areas without modern ovens, this method was both practical and flavorful. The smell of roasting sweet potatoes would fill the air, drawing children and adults alike to the hearth. Once cooked, they could be split open and eaten right from the skin, often as a snack on cold evenings. This was food tied to patience and tradition, a reminder that sometimes the simplest preparations yield the richest flavors. Today, with most cooking moved indoors and convenience foods replacing old methods, ash-cooked sweet potatoes are rarely made, but for those who tasted them, they remain unmatched. Brought dramatic color and smooth tang to every celebration during the 1970s. The batter, tinted with just enough cocoa and a splash of red food coloring, baked into striking crimson layers that contrasted beautifully with the snowy frosting. Cream cheese whipped with butter and powdered sugar provided a silky finish that balanced the cake's subtle chocolate flavor with gentle tang. Each slice looked like a piece of art on a plate, making it a favorite for church anniversaries, wedding receptions, and holiday feasts. The recipe's origins carried whispers of both Southern tradition and a growing national fascination with bold presentation. Serving red velvet cake was a statement of style and hospitality, a way to show guests that a little extra effort could create something unforgettable. Families treasured the excitement it brought to the dessert table, proving that a dash of color and a touch of cream cheese could transform a simple cake into an icon of joy and celebration. Coconut sheet cake was the chilled cypress berry relish brought a sharp tang to otherwise plain meals by using the small, resin-scented berries of native cypress trees. Gatherers collected the ripe berries carefully, then simmered them with a little water and a drizzle of molasses when available, creating a dark, aromatic relish with a unique balance of sweet and bitter flavors. This condiment enlivened cornbread, stewed greens, or smoked fish, adding variety to a diet that often lacked spices. The recipe reflected African traditions of turning wild fruits into bold sauces, and also borrowed techniques from indigenous peoples who valued cypress for its medicinal properties. Though seldom made today, the memory of cypress berry relish lingers in regional stories of swamp foraging and resourceful cooking. It highlights how a deep understanding of the local ecosystem allowed people to transform unexpected ingredients into something flavorful and sustaining. Cypress berry relish stands as a tribute to both culinary creativity and the enduring connection between survival foods and the natural abundance of the southern wetlands. Tell us which survival food amazed you most, like this video, and subscribe to keep these powerful food traditions alive. Sweet potato biscuits once brought warmth to breakfast tables and Sunday dinners alike. Mashed sweet potatoes blended with flour, butter, and a touch of sugar created a dough that baked into soft, slightly sweet rounds. These biscuits paired beautifully with salty country ham or a drizzle of sorghum syrup, offering a perfect balance of savory and sweet. Families often baked them in batches large enough to feed relatives and neighbors, turning an ordinary morning into a quiet feast. The natural sweetness of the potatoes gave the biscuits a gentle orange hue, a visual comfort as well as a culinary one. Children were often given the task of mashing the cooked potatoes, a small role that made them proud participants in a beloved family recipe. Today, store-bought rolls and instant mixes have replaced the slow, careful preparation of true sweet potato biscuits. For those who remember their fragrance filling the kitchen, each bite carries memories of kinship, generosity, and a heritage that deserves to be cherished. Pine bark tea was one of the oldest remedies in the arsenal of survival, brewed from the inner bark of pine trees when other nourishment was gone. The bark was stripped, boiled in water until the liquid turned deep amber, and drunk to fight scurvy, fever, or the chill of endless work. It carried a sharp, resinous flavor, bitter yet strangely comforting to those who knew it well. The tea gave strength when nothing else could, its warmth tracing a line from the forest to the heart. For those denied medicine and rest, this humble brew became both cure and comfort. It was a reminder that the earth itself could provide healing, even when people were deprived of every other resource. Pine bark tea was not just drink, it was proof that knowledge, passed from African and indigenous hands alike, could turn even bark into life. Butter beans and rice were another cheap but comforting meal that carried families through lean times. Butter beans, with their creamy texture, were slow cooked until tender, often flavored with a smoked ham hock or bone if one was available. The smoky taste infused the beans and created a rich broth that poured beautifully over rice. My grandmother used long-grain rice that stretched a pot of beans into enough servings for the whole household. The dish was hearty, filling, and nourishing, feeding both body and spirit. Butter beans were inexpensive compared to meat, yet they carried enough protein to keep families going strong. Children learned to appreciate the soft beans and flavorful broth as part of everyday meals, and adults recognized their value in stretching budgets. It was not a dish of extravagance but of practicality, a dinner that turned cheap staples into something people looked forward to. Butter beans and rice told the story of resilience in kitchens where every penny counted and every plate needed to satisfy. Cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality, tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times. Collard greens with potlikker was a dish where nothing went to waste and flavor reigned supreme. Collard greens were simmered for hours with smoked pork or turkey, allowing their sturdy leaves to soften and absorb the rich, savory essence of the meat. The resulting broth, known as potlikker, was a nutrient-packed liquid treasured as much as the greens themselves. Served with cornbread for dipping, it was both meal and sustenance, especially in lean times. In African-American cooking, this was more than just a side. It was a way to nourish the body fully, drawing on traditions of resourcefulness passed down through generations. Potlikker was even believed to have restorative qualities, making it a home remedy as well as a culinary staple. The flavor was deep, smoky, and satisfying, with the greens offering a balance of bitterness and earthiness. While collard greens remain a symbol of Southern cooking, the reverence for potlikker has faded, leaving behind a tradition worth remembering for its taste and history alike. Peach cobbler with biscuit topping was the heart of many summer evenings in African-American homes of the 1970s, a dessert that tasted like sunshine caught in a pan. Juicy peaches were tossed with brown sugar, lemon juice, and a whisper of cinnamon until their natural syrup began to bubble. Over this golden fruit, a blanket of soft biscuit dough was dropped in spoonfuls, each one browning to a tender crust as the oven worked its magic. The scent of warm fruit and butter drifted through open windows, calling neighbors to stop by for a plate. Served with a drizzle of fresh cream or a scoop of homemade ice cream, every bite balanced tart peach with sweet, flaky topping. Families loved how the cobbler came together from simple pantry staples yet felt luxurious enough for company. It carried the legacy of Southern kitchens into a modern decade, proving that when peaches are ripe and the air is warm, nothing brings people together faster than the promise of a bubbling pan of cobbler shared straight from the oven. Apple brown. Betty brought Depression-era thrift. Roasted gourd seeds turned the remnants of pumpkins and native gourds into a vital source of fat and minerals. After the flesh was cooked for soups or pies, seeds were washed, lightly salted, and spread near the hearth to dry before roasting. This simple preparation produced a crunchy, nutrient-rich snack that stored well through the winter and could be ground into meal or used to thicken stews. Similar seed roasting traditions existed across West Africa, where pumpkin and melon seeds were prized for both flavor and nutrition, and those techniques crossed the Atlantic with enslaved people. Over time, roasted pumpkin seeds became a familiar autumn treat in American households, sold at fairs and enjoyed during harvest celebrations. The practice illustrates how African culinary memory merged with indigenous crops, creating a food that moved from necessity to seasonal pleasure. Roasted gourd seeds continue to appear in modern kitchens and farmers markets, carrying with them the history of careful saving and the resourceful spirit that turned every part of the plant into nourishment. Skillet. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust was the pride of riverbank communities and churchyard gatherings. Fishermen returned at dawn with fresh-caught catfish while cooks prepared heavy iron skillets filled with hot lard or peanut oil. Fillets were dredged in seasoned cornmeal until every piece was coated in a golden layer ready for the crackling pan. The sizzle of fish hitting the oil was music to children waiting for the first crisp bite. Friday fish fries became weekly celebrations where neighbors brought sides of slaw and hush puppies, and stories flowed as freely as sweet tea. The flavor of smoky river water lingered in each flaky bite, reminding everyone of the connection between food and place. Modern diners may order catfish in restaurants, but the ritual of catching, cleaning, and frying by the water's edge has faded, leaving only memories of warm evenings when the entire town smelled of cornmeal and spice and laughter carried across the banks. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays, they were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Wild onion and garlic mix was both food and medicine, gathered by those who knew the land as well as any healer. In damp meadows and riverbanks, the green shoots sprouted freely, filling baskets with flavor when rations tasted dull or stale. Boiled into soups or pounded into paste, the bulbs masked bitterness and helped fight colds or fever. Their strong scent filled the air, signaling nourishment in a place where it was often scarce. The people who gathered them worked quietly at dawn, plucking the roots from the earth, grateful for the sharp fragrance that promised vitality. When boiled with beans or greens, these humble plants gave meals depth and warmth, reminding people of home, of something green and alive. Mixing wild onion and garlic with beans or greens brought a comfort that was small but deeply human, the warmth of a familiar taste. These foraged bulbs were proof that knowledge was power, and survival often depended on remembering the wisdom that nature whispered to those willing to listen. In every bowl, seasoned this way, lived both healing and defiance, the flavor of life persisting despite deprivation, a small spark of dignity and strength hidden in every spoonful. Potatoes stored in burlap sacks were the dependable backbone of winter meals because potatoes were cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin in storage. Families kept sacks in cool corners of cellars, checking them occasionally to remove any that softened. Potatoes became fries, mashed dishes, stews, hash, and even bread when flour ran low. They kept stomachs full when little else could. Children learned early how to scrub them clean, peel them thin, and help with dinner. Potatoes carried families through the Depression with quiet reliability. They offered endless versatility, fitting into every meal of the day without complaint. A single sack could feed a household for weeks, turning scarcity into sustenance and uncertainty into something manageable. Potatoes were dependable in a way few ingredients were. They sprouted slowly, stored easily, and transformed into whatever a meal needed. Families leaned on them heavily, grateful for a food that stretched, adapted, and never failed. In kitchens stretched thin by hardship, potatoes were stability in edible form. Hoghead cheese or souse meat was not fancy food, but it had deep roots in tradition and respect for what you had. Made from the head of the pig, boiled, seasoned, and set in its own broth, it was a dish born from necessity and pride. It was eaten cold, sliced thin, and often shared at the table with crackers and conversation. What others might have thrown away became something flavorful and lasting in the right hands. It spoke of times when wasting food was unthinkable, when every part of the animal was used to honor the work that went into raising it. The smell of it cooking filled the whole house, sharp and strong, but it was the kind of smell that meant good things were coming. When cooled and sliced, it glistened in the light like proof of survival itself. Each piece held a story of long days, careful hands, and families who knew that resourcefulness was its own kind of wealth. Souse meat wasn't about glamour, it was about gratitude. Even if you didn't grow up eating it, the story it told was universal. Make do, make it good, and never take a meal for granted. Buffalo tongue with sage was once a reward, a delicacy saved for elders or honored guests. It was not just meat, it was respect. Plains tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne honored every part of the buffalo. But the tongue, tender, rich, and layered with flavor, was something special. After a hunt, it was carefully cleaned, boiled for hours with herbs like wild sage, and sometimes seared by fire to lock in the taste. It was soft, slightly gamey, and soaked in meaning. This was not a casual weeknight meal. This was served with reverence. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who has ever tasted it, let alone cooked it. Buffalo herds have dwindled. Tongue meat, once prized, is now dismissed. People want boneless, skinless, bland, and easy. They shy away from parts of the animal that take time, that require skill. That is the real loss. It was not just the extinction of a recipe. It was the forgetting of how to appreciate something fully. Every part, every bite, that meal taught humility. And now it is gone. Erased by preference, by modern palates, and by a hunger that no longer remembers where food really comes from. Flavor, a dessert beloved by elders who remembered leaner times. Sticky caramel made from brown sugar and butter lined the bottom of a cast-iron skillet, followed by plump prunes soaked in warm water until tender. A simple batter of flour, eggs, and a touch of cinnamon was poured over the fruit and baked until the house filled with a deep, fruity aroma. When inverted, the cake revealed glistening prunes coated in caramel syrup, their sweetness balanced by subtle spice. Served warm with a dollop of whipped cream, it was a taste of old-world resourcefulness carried into a new decade. Families cherished how a humble dried fruit could create such richness, reminding everyone that tradition never goes out of style. Prune upside-down cake kept history alive at the dessert table, turning what some considered ordinary into something extraordinary with every dense, flavorful slice. Cornmeal. Pound cake carried the rustic charm of traditional Southern sweets into the lively kitchens of the 19th. Mulberry leaf wraps transformed young, tender leaves from the wild mulberry tree into clever edible packages. Foragers selected the freshest leaves in spring when they were soft and mild, then blanched them briefly to soften their texture. Cooked rice, seasoned vegetables, or small bits of preserved fish were spooned inside before the leaves were folded and steamed, creating tidy bundles filled with subtle, earthy flavor. This technique echoed African traditions of wrapping foods in leaves for both cooking and preservation, blending seamlessly with indigenous American practices. The result was a portable meal that required no extra containers and made use of a tree that also provided sweet berries later in the season. After emancipation, mulberry leaves continued to appear in Southern folk remedies and tea blends, but the memory of leaf-wrapped suppers remains a quiet testament to ingenuity. Mulberry leaf wraps illustrate how a single plant could meet many needs, offering nourishment, flavor, and practicality to communities that transformed every part of their environment into sustenance. Homemade chow chow relish added brightness and crunch to plates crowded with greens, beans, and smoked meats. Cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes were chopped fine and simmered with vinegar, mustard seed, and sugar until they formed a tangy condiment that could last through winter. Every household had a slightly different recipe, some sweeter, some hotter, each a reflection of the cook's own hand. The relish brought sharp contrast to rich dishes like pork shoulder or pinto beans, cutting through heaviness with a lively bite. In late summer, neighbors gathered to chop vegetables together, sharing stories as big pots bubbled on outdoor fires. Jars lined pantry shelves in rows of glowing gold and green, a promise of flavor when fresh produce was long gone. Over time, store-bought pickles and bottled sauces replaced the careful preparation of chow chow, but its memory endures wherever families recall the sound of knives on wooden boards and the reward of a bright spoonful alongside a hearty meal. Fried rice with scrambled egg was the kind of supper that could be made out of almost nothing but still managed to feel hearty. Leftover rice was saved from the night before, reheated in a skillet with a little oil or lard, and then combined with scrambled egg to add richness. My grandmother would sometimes add chopped onion or green pepper if the garden allowed, but the dish stood strong even without extras. The rice fried up golden, the egg binding it together into something more than scraps. A dash of salt and pepper finished it, though hot sauce often appeared at the table too. What amazed me was how it transformed simple grains into a filling plate that stretched across a family without breaking the budget. The meal carried warmth and thrift in equal measure, reminding everyone that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled egg was not fancy, but it was dependable, the kind of dish that fed children and adults alike with just enough to keep spirits steady. Brine-preserved greens were an ingenious way to hold on to summer's bounty long after the fields went bare. Collards, mustard greens, and turnip tops were packed into wooden barrels filled with salt water, weighed down with stones, and sealed tight. Over weeks, the leaves softened and fermented slightly, taking on a tangy flavor that woke up the dullest winter meal. They could be rinsed and cooked with lard, onions, or whatever scraps were available. This simple method kept vitamins alive in seasons when fresh food was impossible to find. The scent that rose when the barrels were opened was sharp, earthy, and comforting, a taste of summer revived in the dead of winter. In homes that had little, these barrels represented life insurance against hunger. Preparing them required patience and precision, the kind of quiet discipline that survival demanded. The barrels lined cabin corners like silent guards against hunger, waiting patiently until their contents were needed. In every household that relied on them, brined greens became a sign of foresight and care, another way the enslaved turned hardship into nourishment, proof that even time itself could be bent toward survival when guided by wisdom and will. Shelf-stable rice was bought in bulk whenever families could spare the money, because rice stretched everything. A single pot filled stomachs, thickened soups, extended stews, and paired with beans in a way that turned simple ingredients into complete meals. Rice never spoiled if stored dry and sealed, which made it one of the safest pantry investments during the Depression. Mothers measured it carefully, knowing exactly how much was needed to feed everyone without wasting a grain. Kids often carried the bags home from the store, feeling like they were holding something important. Rice anchored dinners when there was no meat, no vegetables, and no time. Families relied on rice for steady comfort, day after day, pot after pot. And beyond filling bellies, rice provided emotional comfort, a sense that even on the leanest nights, there would still be something warm to eat. Elders taught younger generations the art of rinsing, simmering, and stretching rice, turning a single pot into the foundation of an entire meal. Rice became a symbol of reliability, proof that simple foods could keep families strong through the hardest seasons. Molasses stack cake was the kind of dessert that carried a sense of occasion. Multiple thin layers of cake, sweetened with rich molasses, were stacked high with spiced apple filling or sorghum syrup spread between them. The layers were assembled in advance, allowing the flavors to meld and the texture to soften into a tender, almost pie-like bite. For African American families in the South, this cake was a way to celebrate with what was on hand, often using sorghum molasses from local mills. It appeared at church suppers, weddings, and holiday feasts, each layer baked carefully and sometimes contributed by different family members. The taste was deep, warm, and slightly tangy, making it distinct from sugar-based cakes. Over time, as refined sugar became more accessible and baking trends shifted, the molasses stack cake faded from everyday kitchens. Yet for those who remember it, the sight of a tall, dark spiced cake still brings back the feeling of a special day when everyone gathered to share. In the 70s, offering a dessert both hearty and refined. Fine cornmeal joined flour, sugar, butter, and fresh eggs to create a batter with gentle grit and warm golden color. Baked slowly in a heavy bundt pan, the cake developed a firm crust while remaining moist within, filling the house with the aroma of sweet corn and vanilla. A light lemon glaze or simple dusting of powdered sugar highlighted its natural flavor without masking its earthy character. Families appreciated how the recipe honored generations of corn-based desserts while embracing the pound cake tradition. Served with seasonal fruit or enjoyed plain alongside coffee, it provided comfort that felt rooted in history and hospitality. Cornmeal pound cake was a reminder of resilience and creativity, turning everyday staples into a treat worthy of celebration and proving that the most humble grains can yield something rich and unforgettable. Carrot pineapple cake combined the natural sweetness of carrots with wild grape, connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape stands as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Boiled peanuts turned the simplest crop into a roadside delicacy beloved across the coastal South. Green peanuts fresh from the field were boiled in salty water for hours until their shells softened and the kernels inside became tender and briny. Travelers stopped at roadside stands where pots steamed and the scent of salt filled the warm air. Vendors scooped the peanuts into paper bags dripping with flavorful liquid, and families ate them hot while driving or sitting on porches in the evening. The snack offered both nourishment and entertainment as friends cracked shells and talked late into the night. Farmers appreciated the way boiled peanuts made use of young harvests that might not keep for roasting. Although convenience stores sell packaged versions, the true experience of a freshly boiled peanut eaten outdoors remains unmatched, carrying the taste of red clay fields, summer humidity, and the easy rhythm of southern hospitality shared one shell at a time. Tell us which tradition you'd bring back, like this video if the memories made you hungry, and subscribe to keep these rich flavors alive. Sassafras bark seasoning was one of the earliest flavorings used when store-bought spices were out of reach. The roots and bark of the sassafras tree were peeled, dried, and ground into powder, its aroma rich with warmth and spice. Sprinkled over cornmeal or beans, it transformed plain food into something fragrant and satisfying. Beyond taste, sassafras carried medicinal value too. It soothed sore throats, eased stomach pains, and was believed to cleanse the blood. Its use came from a blend of African and native traditions, a shared understanding that flavor could also heal. For those whose daily meals were often bland or repetitive, this bark brought a hint of joy. Even the smallest dash felt like a luxury. When added to boiling pots, the air would fill with its woodsy scent, a moment of beauty amid scarcity. Families guarded small pouches of ground bark like treasure, passing the habit from one generation to the next. In times when dignity was stolen, seasoning food became a quiet way to reclaim it. Sassafras was more than spice. It was spirit made edible, a reminder that even the simplest flavor could speak of memory, culture, and resilience. Homemade jams from wild berries were the sweetest reward of summer for families who knew how to make the most out of whatever the land offered. Kids gathered blackberries, dewberries, and mulberries in buckets, fingers stained purple by the time they returned home. Grandmothers turned the fruit into jams that bubbled on the stove, thickened with sugar when it was available and stretched carefully when it was not. These jars carried the taste of warm months into cold, bleak winters. A spoonful on bread made a meal feel complete. Jams were a reminder that even hard times could still offer sweetness. Every jar was a quiet celebration of community labor, berry-picking trips, and afternoons spent stirring a pot that promised comfort in the cold months ahead. For families surviving the Depression, jam was more than food. It was proof that joy could be saved for later. Each jar represented foresight, love, and a determination to preserve not just fruit, but a sense of normalcy. When opened in winter, those jams brought color and hope to tables that often lacked both. Purple beauty of ripe berries. Fresh blackberries simmered with sugar and a splash of lemon juice until they released their juices, creating a fragrant syrup. Spoonfuls of sweet biscuit dough were dropped into the bubbling fruit, puffing as they cooked and soaking up the dark berry flavor. The dumplings grew tender, yet kept a slight chew, offering a satisfying contrast to the rich sauce. Served warm in deep bowls, sometimes with a drizzle of cream, this dessert combined the comfort of cobbler with the heartiness of country dumplings. Families in the 1970s loved how it transformed simple berries into a dessert big enough to feed a crowd. Blackberry dumplings were both rustic and elegant, proving that a pot of fruit and a handful of dough could yield something that tasted like summer itself. An edible memory of gathering berries under the sun and sharing the rewards with everyone at the table. Peanut butter sheet cake was a crowd-pleasing dessert that traveled easily from school cafeterias. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and old-world methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Hand-pulled taffy candy brought winter nights alive with laughter and sticky hands. Families boiled sorghum or cane syrup with sugar until it reached the perfect glossy stage, then poured the hot mixture onto buttered slabs to cool slightly. Children and adults alike greased their palms and began the rhythmic pulling, stretching the warm candy until it turned light and airy. The kitchen filled with the sweet smell of caramel as ropes of taffy were twisted and cut into bite-sized pieces. It was as much about the gathering as the candy, a shared activity that warmed cold evenings and strengthened family ties. Neighbors might stop by to help, turning the process into a spontaneous party where stories and jokes flowed as freely as the sugary strands. Store-bought sweets eventually replaced the long, careful ritual, but the memory of shining taffy and joyful pulling remains vivid for those who once stood in the glow of a winter stove and felt the magic of homemade candy. Cypress root brew was medicine born from necessity and wisdom. When doctors and remedies were out of reach, the roots of the cypress tree became healer and hope. Boiled into a dark, fragrant tea, it was used to ease fever, pain, and swelling, its scent filling cabins with earthy calm. The recipe came from shared knowledge, African herbal practice intertwined with indigenous tradition. It was strong, almost bitter, but it worked, and that was enough. Making it meant turning to the land, trusting it to restore what cruelty and exhaustion had taken away. Every cup was a quiet act of care in a world built on deprivation. It did not cure everything, but it reminded those who drank it that healing could still exist where freedom did not. Dried herbs from backyard gardens were one of the quietest but most powerful tools families depended on during the Depression. Backyard plots grew sage, thyme, mint, and anything else that could survive the heat. And at the end of summer, families gathered the bundles to hang from rafters or porch lines. When food was plain, and it often was, these herbs brought life back into pots of beans, vegetables, or stews. A pinch of dried thyme could make a pot taste like someone put care into it, even if ingredients were minimal. Elders taught children how to tie the herbs, where to hang them, and how to crumble them into dishes. These homegrown seasonings carried flavor, memory, and tradition through the harshest seasons. Peanut soup demonstrated the brilliance of using locally grown legumes to create filling, nutritious meals from almost nothing. Peanuts, grown throughout the South and often harvested by black farmers, were ground into paste and mixed with water, onions, and whatever seasonings could be found. The mixture cooked down into creamy soup that provided protein, fat, and comfort. This wasn't the refined peanut butter soup found in fancy cookbooks. It was rough, grainy, and honest, tasting of earth and survival. Black families made peanut soup regularly because peanuts stored well and could be ground by hand using simple tools. The soup filled hungry children before school and warmed field workers who came home exhausted after dark. In Alabama and Georgia, where peanuts were staple crops, this soup appeared so frequently it became associated with Depression hardship. Yet it delivered genuine nutrition. Peanuts provided complete protein and essential fats that kept bodies functioning during starvation conditions with community support. Field pea and okra succotash was a colorful summer dish that combined the nutty taste of fresh field peas with the silky texture of okra and the sweetness of corn. Cooked gently in butter or with a touch of bacon fat, it celebrated the harvest season, bringing together vegetables that grew abundantly in southern gardens. African American cooks often prepared it for family meals and community gatherings, serving it as a side or a light main dish with cornbread. The blend of textures, from the tender peas to the soft okra, created a satisfying balance, while the corn added bursts of sweetness. This dish reflected a strong connection to the land and the value placed on fresh, seasonal produce. As farming and home gardening declined, the tradition of making succotash with truly fresh ingredients became rarer, turning it into a nostalgic reminder of summer tables and garden-to-plate cooking. Pie brought a touch of elegance to African American dinner tables of the 1970s, its glossy peaks of toasted meringue hiding a silky chocolate custard beneath. The filling began with whole milk warmed slowly on the stove, blended with sugar, cocoa powder, and egg yolks until it thickened to a rich, velvety texture. A flaky homemade crust provided the base, sturdy enough to cradle the warm chocolate without becoming soggy. Once poured and cooled slightly, the pie was crowned with a cloud of whipped egg whites sweetened with sugar, carefully spread to the edges to seal the filling. A few minutes in the oven turned the meringue golden brown, creating a dessert that shimmered like a jewel when brought to the table. Each slice revealed the satisfying contrast of airy topping and decadent center, a harmony of textures that delighted guests at Sunday dinners and church socials. Chocolate meringue pie was both comfort and celebration, a showpiece that proved skill and love in every bite. Prune upside-down cake offered a moist, gently spiced reward for families who valued thrift as much as molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Molasses-glazed ham hocks were a centerpiece of many family meals, slow-cooked until tender and coated with a rich, sweet molasses glaze that caramelized beautifully. Ham hocks, a tougher and more affordable cut of pork, were prized for their flavor and ability to infuse dishes with smoky depth. The molasses glaze added a distinct sweetness that balanced the savory richness of the meat and helped transform humble ingredients into a festive dish. Families often served these glazed hocks with hearty sides like collard greens, black-eyed peas, or cornbread, creating meals that were both filling and flavorful. This dish was popular during times when making the most out of every ingredient was essential, and molasses was a common sweetener available in many households. The slow cooking process allowed the meat to fall off the bone, making it perfect for sharing. Molasses-glazed ham hocks were more than just food. They were a symbol of community, celebration, and culinary resourcefulness that has sadly faded from everyday cooking. Leftover bones saved for broth were one of the greatest acts of Depression-era ingenuity. When meat was a rarity, bones were never thrown away. They were the foundation of meals. Grandmothers simmered them for hours with onions, scraps of vegetables, and whatever seasoning they had, pulling every bit of flavor from bone to water. The result was a rich, savory broth that fed families across several meals. Rice, dumplings, or vegetables added to the pot created dishes that tasted far more generous than the ingredients allowed. Bones could be reused more than once, simmered again until every trace of nourishment had been pulled free. This was not just frugality, it was survival passed down through generations, where even the barest ingredients could become a pot of comfort. Families gathered around bowls of broth that warmed bodies and spirits after long days of hard work. Children learned early that bones carried more value than they appeared to, holding flavor that could be coaxed out with patience and care. These broths formed the backbone of many Depression-era dishes, quietly proving that resourcefulness could turn almost nothing into something sustaining. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Custard that tasted far richer than its modest origins. Eggs, sugar, butter, and tangy buttermilk whisked together into a smooth filling that baked in a single crust until the surface browned lightly and the center set to a creamy consistency. The slight tang of the buttermilk balanced the sweetness, making each bite both comforting and intriguing. African-American families in the 1970s valued the recipe for its thrift and reliability, knowing that even in lean times a luxurious dessert was within reach. Served warm or chilled, plain or with a scattering of fresh berries, buttermilk pie delighted guests without demanding complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. Its enduring charm lay in the way it brought people together around something humble yet special. Each slice carried the quiet satisfaction of resourcefulness and tradition, a reminder that the heart of hospitality often rests in the simplest, most lovingly prepared dishes shared at the end of a long meal. Secret ingredient, but won them over with every moist bite, becoming a budget-friendly miracle in the 1970s. Pantry staples of flour, cocoa powder, and sugar were whisked with a generous spoonful of mayonnaise, whose eggs and oil gave the cake a tender crumb without extra butter. Baked in a simple rectangular pan, it emerged dark and velvety, filling the kitchen with a rich cocoa aroma. A quick frosting of powdered sugar and milk or a swirl of chocolate buttercream turned it into a dessert fit for birthdays, bake sales, or late-night treats. Families loved how the recipe saved money while delivering a texture rivaling any fancy bakery cake. Guests often guessed at the secret but rarely believed it, which made serving it even more fun. Chocolate mayonnaise cake reminded everyone that ingenuity and a bit of courage could transform an ordinary weeknight into something indulgent, proving that good taste does not need expensive ingredients when creativity leads the way. Pecan praline bars brought a taste of New Orleans. Pig feet and collard greens brought together two ingredients that white society dismissed, but Black communities transformed into soul-satisfying meals. Pig feet, boiled until tender and gelatinous, released collagen that thickened cooking liquid into rich, silky broth. Collard greens, tough and bitter when raw, simmered in that broth for hours until they turned tender and deeply flavored. The combination created a pot of food that could feed 8 people for under 50 cents during Depression years. Black cooks added vinegar and hot peppers to cut through the richness, creating layers of flavor that made each bite interesting despite simple ingredients. In sharecropping communities, this dish appeared regularly because both ingredients were readily available. Pigs provided feet even when better cuts went to landowners, and collards grew abundantly in gardens. The potlikker left behind was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or saved for cooking rice. Children learned to appreciate pig feet's unique texture, the meat slipping off bones and the skin turning silky after long cooking despite crushing poverty. Dried okra for thickening gumbo was one of the quiet secrets that kept Southern cooking alive during the Depression, especially in African-American kitchens where every preserved ingredient mattered. When fresh okra was in season, families sliced it thin and laid it out to dry in the sun, letting time and heat preserve what they could not afford to waste. Once dried, the okra hardened into little pieces that stored well for months and became a lifeline when winter took away access to fresh produce. When tossed into a pot of gumbo, stew, or broth, those pieces softened again and released the same rich, earthy thickness. Fresh okra was known for. It made thin soups hearty, stretched ingredients further, and gave meals the sense of fullness families needed to keep going. This was not just a cooking technique. It was survival rooted in tradition, memory, and the understanding that food had to last long after the harvest ended. Dried okra tasted like resourcefulness, like summers saved for later, and like the quiet brilliance of women who knew how to make a pot feed an entire household.
Skillet might sound like something you'd say while sneezing, but it was once one of the sweetest roots in the patch. Grown in colder climates and cultivated in neat rows, this starchy vegetable produced clusters of thin, white roots that were naturally sugary. So sweet, in fact, they were sometimes eaten raw. Indigenous gardeners in northern regions prize skillet for its flavor and adaptability. It could be roasted, boiled, mashed, or made into fritters and stews, its taste falling somewhere between carrot and parsnip with a smooth, creamy texture. But as maize agriculture spread and corn began dominating both fields and diets, skillet fell out of favor. It just didn't scale like corn, nor did it compete with the growing number of introduced crops. But before skillet slipped away, another seasonal player showed up every spring, bearing fruit that had to be timed just right.
Noons and childhood visits to Grandma's house, their soft sugar cookie texture carrying a gentle vanilla fragrance. Butter, sugar, and fresh eggs were beaten together until light, then mixed with flour and a hint of nutmeg to create a dough that chilled before baking. Rolled and cut into simple rounds, the cakes puffed slightly as they baked, filling the kitchen with a sweet, buttery aroma. Neither overly sweet nor bland, they struck a perfect balance that invited dunking in tea or milk. Families treasured these cookies for their simplicity and the way they invited conversation, often baking them in large batches to share with neighbors. In the 1970s, tea cakes were a quiet staple of African American hospitality, a link. Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Mustard greens with smoked turkey necks carried the flavor of endurance from one generation to the next. During the Great Depression and later years when ham hocks became expensive or scarce, cooks turned to the neck bones of smoked turkey for the same rich depth. The greens simmered slowly in seasoned broth until tender, soaking up the smoky essence of the meat and the spice of crushed red pepper. Families gathered around the pot to breathe in the savory aroma while cornbread baked in the oven. This dish offered nourishment and warmth, proof that ingenuity could turn modest ingredients into a feast. Children learned to wash and tear the greens while elders seasoned by taste alone, passing down a craft more than a recipe. Today, pre-washed greens and quick cooking methods have dulled the ritual, but the memory of long simmering pots and the steady comfort of smoked turkey necks remains a powerful reminder of resilience and shared meals. Pickled cucumbers and vegetables were the crunch that brightened tables during months when everything else was soft, boiled, or stretched thin. Families filled jars with cucumbers, okra, peppers, onions, and anything that could be saved before it spoiled. Vinegar, salt, and spices transformed simple produce into jars that lasted all winter. Opening a jar of pickles during the Depression felt like a treat, sharp, bright, and refreshing at a time when fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to come by. Kids loved the snap. Adults appreciated the shelf life, and everyone knew those jars represented planning and survival. Pickled vegetables gave families something to look forward to when meals felt repetitive and resources felt tight. They reminded people that even in the hardest years, there was room for something lively and flavorful on the table. Each jar held small pieces of effort, memory, and hope sealed tight for the months ahead, proving that a little bit of brightness could go a very long way. Okra and tomato stew was a garden-born staple that thrived in warm southern summers when vegetables were plentiful. Fresh okra pods, picked before they grew tough, were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and bell peppers until the flavors melded into a thick, savory stew. The okra's natural thickening quality gave the dish a comforting, almost silky texture, while the tomatoes added tang and brightness. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of smoked meat for depth, this was a dish that could stand alone with cornbread or be served alongside fish or chicken. In African American kitchens, it was a way to make the most of backyard gardens and stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal. It could be made entirely vegetarian or enriched with bits of bacon or ham hock, depending on what was available. The beauty of okra and tomato stew lay in its adaptability. Each household had its own variation, often influenced by what was growing just outside the kitchen door. Though it remains known in some southern homes, its presence has faded as fresh garden cooking has become less common in everyday life. Watermelon rind stew reflects the creativity and endurance of people forced to survive on the edges of the plantation food system. The sweet red fruit was usually reserved for those in the owner's household, but the pale green rind, often thrown away, became a valuable ingredient for the enslaved cooks who transformed scraps into nourishment. Strips of rind were simmered slowly with onions, garden herbs, and whatever seasoning could be gathered or traded, creating a mellow broth rich in minerals and gentle sweetness. This practice traveled forward in time, inspiring the pickled watermelon rind that remains a hallmark of Southern home kitchens today. The dish is more than a recipe. It is a record of resilience, showing how African culinary knowledge turned waste into sustenance and flavor. In modern celebrations of African American foodways, watermelon rind pickles and stews continue to honor those who preserved health and dignity through skilled cooking even when denied basic freedom. Caramel layer cake stood tall and proud at birthdays, church anniversaries, and family reunions, its rich frosting gleaming like bronze. Bakers stacked 3 or 4 buttery yellow cake layers, each tender and moist, then spread warm, homemade caramel icing between them, letting it drip luxuriously down the sides. The icing required patience, cooked slowly with sugar, cream, and a little butter until it reached the perfect stage of deep amber sweetness. As it cooled, it formed a soft yet slightly chewy shell, creating a texture contrast that guests adored. Cutting the cake revealed ribbons of caramel clinging to each slice, a sight that made even adults clap their hands like children. In African American kitchens of the 1970s, mastering caramel icing was a badge of honor and a skill passed lovingly through generations. Caramel layer cake was a dessert of celebration and craft, showing that with time, steady stirring, and a watchful eye, simple ingredients could become a centerpiece worthy of every milestone worth remembering. Chitlins holiday feast once marked winter celebrations with an aroma as unforgettable as the labor required to prepare it. Hog intestines were cleaned thoroughly, then simmered for hours with onions, vinegar, and spices until tender. The dish demanded patience and community, often bringing families together for a full day of washing and cooking. Served with hot sauce and cornbread, chitlins carried the history of using every part of the animal, a practice born of necessity during slavery and carried forward as a mark of resilience. Despite the strong scent that filled kitchens and neighborhoods, the feast represented abundance and pride, especially during Christmas and New Year gatherings. Elders spoke of the old days while younger generations learned the careful methods required to make the dish safe and flavorful. In many places, health concerns and changing tastes have pushed chitlins aside, but the tradition still holds a powerful place in memory as a symbol of perseverance and celebration. Roasted acorn mash was one of the earliest lessons in transformation, how something bitter could be made good. Acorns gathered from the forest floor were soaked for days to wash away their harsh tannins, then ground, roasted, and stirred into porridge or cakes. The work was slow, but the result was nourishing, dense, and filling enough to last through the hardest labor. It carried the deep, nutty scent of the woods and a flavor unlike anything from a store shelf today. Making acorn mash required patience and knowledge passed down through generations, blending African technique with native wisdom. It was survival as craft, every step deliberate, every bite earned. For those who lived on the edge of hunger, this humble meal was both shield and strength. It proved that what others overlooked could become a feast in the right hands. Homemade vinegar stored in bottles was one of the most useful items in a Depression-era kitchen. Made by fermenting leftover fruit scraps, peels, or even water and sugar, it cost almost nothing but gave families the ability to preserve vegetables, season greens, brighten stews, and even clean their homes. Vinegar's sharp tang lifted bland meals, made pickling possible, and helped stretch produce much longer than it would otherwise last. Families kept bottles tucked away in dark corners ready whenever a jar needed filling. It added flavor when spices were limited and helped meals feel fresher even after days of eating the same ingredients. Homemade vinegar was a tool of survival shaped from scraps, proof that even waste could become something valuable. It was a small miracle in a bottle, transforming ordinary vegetables into jars of vibrancy that lasted through long winters. Children often remembered the sour smell drifting through the kitchen as jars sealed with soft pops. Vinegar also served as medicine, cleaning agent, and food preserver all at once, making it one of the most versatile things a family could keep on hand. Hoppin' John was more than just a meal. It was a tradition steeped in hope and symbolism. Made from black-eyed peas simmered with onions, peppers, and pork, then served over rice, it was a dish prepared on New Year's Day to bring good luck for the year ahead. In African-American kitchens, especially in the South, the peas represented coins and the rice symbolized abundance, while the greens, often served alongside, stood for paper money. Smoked ham hock, bacon, or fatback lent a deep, savory flavor that turned simple ingredients into something rich and comforting. Families would gather around bowls of Hoppin' John, sharing not only food but the belief in a better year to come. Its origins trace back to West African culinary traditions brought over by enslaved people, blending with Southern ingredients to create a uniquely African-American staple. While it is still made in some homes today, the widespread observance of this tradition has waned, and many now know it only by name. Yet for those who keep it alive, Hoppin' John remains a flavorful reminder of heritage, resilience, and the power of food to carry meaning. Flavor and a silky custard that made every bite feel like sunshine. A simple filling of fresh lemon juice, sugar, eggs, and butter, baked into a single crust until the top developed a delicate golden sheen and the center set to a creamy, tangy perfection. The pie cooled to a gentle wobble that invited quick slicing and generous servings. Families loved how the dessert used basic ingredients yet delivered a sophisticated citrus punch, ideal for cutting through rich dinners or heavy holiday spreads. Lemon chess pie brought a welcome spark to church luncheons, family reunions, and Sunday suppers throughout the 1970s. Its zesty aroma filled kitchens with a hint of spring even in the heart of winter, offering comfort and brightness in equal measure. This pie proved that elegance could come from everyday staples, turning lemons and sugar into a memorable finale that refreshed the spirit and left guests asking for the recipe to share and cherish. Buttermilk pie wrapped simple pantry ingredients into a velvety. Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the southern landscape's hidden gifts. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Hoppin' John on New Year's Day was once a dish of deep meaning, carrying the promise of good fortune into every household that served it. Black-eyed peas simmered with rice, onions, and smoky cured meat made for a meal that was both filling and symbolic. Families across the South would gather on the first day of the year, confident that a bowl of this humble combination could bring luck, health, and steady work in the months ahead. The peas represented coins, the rice suggested abundance, and the pork gave a sense of strength and perseverance. Elders passed down stories of how this recipe came from West African traditions that traveled through the Middle Passage and took root in Carolina kitchens. Children learned to stir the pot while listening to tales of ancestors who found comfort in its aroma after days of uncertainty. Today, many people know the name, but few carry on the ritual with the same devotion that once marked every New Year's morning across countless African American homes. Okra and tomato stew was a garden-born staple that thrived in warm southern summers when vegetables were plentiful. Fresh okra pods, picked before they grew tough, were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and bell peppers until the flavors melded into a thick, savory stew. The okra's natural thickening quality gave the dish a comforting, almost silky texture, while the tomatoes added tang and brightness. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of smoked meat for depth, this was a dish that could stand alone with cornbread or be served alongside fish or chicken. In African American kitchens, it was a way to make the most of backyard gardens and stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal. It could be made entirely vegetarian or enriched with bits of bacon or ham hock, depending on what was available. The beauty of okra and tomato stew lay in its adaptability. Each household had its own variation, often influenced by what was growing just outside the kitchen door. Though it remains known in some southern homes, its presence has faded as fresh garden cooking has become less common in everyday life. Collard green bunches for drying were common because greens grew well, fed many mouths, and could be preserved long after harvest. Families tied them in bundles, hung them in kitchens or porches, and let them dry slowly in the air. These dried leaves were later simmered with whatever seasoning was available, turning into tender, flavorful greens even in the dead of winter when fresh produce was out of reach. Sometimes a scrap of fatback went into the pot, but even when it did not, the greens still tasted like comfort. Every dried bunch felt like a piece of summer tucked away for later. This practice connected generations. Children watched elders hang the bunches, learning quietly how to prepare for the months ahead. It was survival, but also tradition, rooted in memory, skill, and a deep understanding of how to make the land stretch. Sweet potato biscuits brought a touch of sweetness to the bread basket, making them a beloved addition to breakfasts and suppers alike. Mashed sweet potatoes were mixed into biscuit dough, giving the bread a soft texture, golden color, and natural sweetness that paired perfectly with both savory and sweet toppings. These biscuits could be enjoyed with fried chicken, drizzled with sorghum syrup, or simply spread with fresh butter. In African American kitchens, especially in the South, they were a way to use leftover baked sweet potatoes and add variety to everyday bread. The earthy sweetness of the potatoes balanced beautifully with the rich, buttery crumb of the biscuit, making them a favorite at church gatherings, Sunday dinners, and holiday meals. They baked up tender yet sturdy, with just enough sweetness to feel special without becoming dessert. Today, sweet potato biscuits are less common outside of certain regions, often replaced by standard white biscuits, but those who remember them speak of their warmth, flavor, and the way they brought people to the table with smiles. To community potlucks, bringing nutty richness in every slice. Smooth peanut butter was melted into a warm mixture of butter and milk before being whisked into flour and sugar to create a thick, fragrant batter. Baked in a large rectangular pan, it emerged golden and tender, its surface ready for a quick pour of warm peanut butter glaze that seeped into the cake as it cooled. Each bite delivered a deep roasted flavor balanced by gentle sweetness, a treat that satisfied children and adults alike. The sheet cake format made serving simple, ensuring everyone received a generous square without fuss. In African American kitchens of the 1970s, peanut butter sheet cake stood as a practical yet indulgent dessert, perfect for feeding big families or lively gatherings. It proved that the humble peanut could create a cake as memorable as any fancy confection, offering warmth and comfort with every moist forkful. Old-fashioned tea cakes tasted like quiet afternoon. Goosefoot seed meal offered vital nourishment when cultivated grains were scarce or too costly. Goosefoot, also known as lamb's quarters, grew abundantly along field edges and yielded tiny seeds rich in protein and minerals. Enslaved harvesters shook the plants over cloths to collect the seeds, then winnowed and ground them into a fine flour. This flour could be cooked into hot cereal, mixed with cornmeal for bread, or used to thicken stews, providing a surprisingly hearty alternative to purchased grain. The practice drew on both African and indigenous traditions of using wild seeds as staple foods. Even after emancipation, rural families in parts of the Midwest and Appalachia continued to gather goosefoot seeds for their high nutritional value. Modern interest in quinoa, which is a close relative, echoes this old wisdom. Goosefoot seed meal stands as a reminder that careful attention to the landscape and patient handwork could turn what many considered weeds into a dependable source of strength and nourishment that kept families fed through the hardest seasons. Pickled watermelon rinds were the epitome of making something from nothing, a perfect reflection of the ingenuity that sustained life under impossible circumstances. The sweet pink flesh of the melon was eaten quickly, but the pale rind, normally discarded, was peeled, cut, and boiled in vinegar with cloves and sugar until translucent. Stored in jars, it became crisp, tangy, and refreshing, a treat that lasted long after harvest. It was both preservation and protest, turning scraps into sustenance. This act of saving every part of what little was available revealed a truth. Survival was not only about endurance, but about creativity. These jars lined kitchen shelves like quiet trophies, gleaming reminders that waste was a privilege few could afford. Even now, a single bite of pickled rind carries that legacy, sweet, sharp, and unbroken. Rendered lard stored in tins was pure gold in Depression kitchens, especially in African American households that knew how to stretch every resource: lard-fried chicken, seasoned beans, flavored greens, baked biscuits, and made pie crusts flaky, even when butter was a distant dream. Families saved every bit of fat they could, rendering it slow until it turned liquid, then letting it cool into a smooth white block that lasted for weeks. A spoonful added richness to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandmothers guarded their lard tins like treasure because they understood just how far it could go. In a time when nothing was wasted, lard became one of the most valuable ingredients in the home, turning scraps and basics into meals that felt whole. Fatback fried cabbage was a simple, deeply satisfying dish that turned a humble head of cabbage into a flavorful side worth remembering. Fatback, a cured slab of pork fat with a rich, salty taste, was diced and fried until it released its golden drippings. Into this savory base went shredded cabbage, sizzling as it hit the hot pan and slowly softening while soaking up all the flavor. The edges browned slightly, giving a hint of caramelization, while the tender leaves carried the smoky richness of the pork. This was a dish that needed no complicated seasoning, just salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. In African American kitchens, especially in the rural South, Fatback fried cabbage was an easy way to feed a family, served alongside cornbread and beans or as part of a larger spread. It represented the practice of using every part of what was available, from the vegetables in the garden to the trimmings from a butchered hog. Today, while cabbage is still common, the tradition of frying it in fatback has faded, replaced by lighter cooking methods, but its flavor remains unforgettable to those who grew up eating it. Persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Jerusalem artichoke cash was a clever answer to hunger, hidden right beneath the soil. These knobby roots, also called sunchokes, grew wild and multiplied easily, making them a dependable food when nothing else survived the frost. After harvest, they were buried in cool earth or sand pits near the home, dug up one by one as winter crept in. Raw, they were crisp like water chestnuts. Boiled or roasted, they turned soft and nutty, rich with warmth. Unlike potatoes, they did not spoil quickly, and unlike corn, they required no field. They belonged to those who had the wisdom to look down, not out, to find food where others saw weeds. Families who kept Jerusalem artichokes knew security in the hardest months. Their flavor was mild, comforting, and slightly sweet, a quiet reward for foresight and care. Each tuber unearthed was a small triumph against scarcity, a quiet declaration that they would make it through another season, one root at a time, a reminder that even in cold earth, sustenance could still grow for those who knew where to look. Home-canned peaches and pears were treasures stored away with the care of something sacred. Families spent late summer picking, peeling, and preserving fruit in jars so there would be something sweet to look forward to when winter felt endless. Those jars lined shelves like colorful reminders that better days had existed and would come again. Opening one was an event. Kids listened for the pop, adults smiled, and everyone knew dessert was going to feel special. Sometimes the fruit was eaten straight from the jar, sometimes spooned over cornbread, and sometimes served on holiday tables like it was fine gold. In a world where sweetness was rare, these jars felt like hope preserved in glass. Those fruits stretched holidays, Sundays, and hard nights alike. They brought sunshine into cold kitchens. They were sweetness, literally saved for survival. Koopy stew, was a hearty, protein-rich dish that could feed a family on little more than field peas, onions, and a bit of cured pork. Simmered low and slow, the cowpeas absorbed the smoky, savory flavors of ham hock or salt pork, creating a rich broth. This was a common dish in African American homes, particularly in the South, where cowpeas were easy to grow and store. The stew was ladled over rice or eaten with cornbread, making it both filling and affordable. Cowpea stew often appeared in late summer and fall when harvests were abundant, and it was a way to stretch fresh produce into satisfying meals. The taste was earthy, the texture creamy, and it carried the comfort of something made to nourish in every sense of the word. Though it remains known in some circles, for many it has faded into memory, overshadowed by other bean and pea recipes. Yet it still stands as a testament to the art of making humble ingredients into something worth remembering. Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers delivered pure comfort in a chilled dish that always seemed to disappear before anyone could ask for seconds. Ripe bananas were sliced thin and layered with crisp vanilla wafers and creamy custard made from milk, eggs, and a hint of vanilla bean. Each layer softened as the pudding rested, allowing the cookies to turn cake-like while the bananas infused the custard with gentle sweetness. A crown of meringue or whipped cream sealed the top, lightly browned in the oven or served fresh from the refrigerator depending on family tradition. Sunday dinners and church socials alike relied on this dessert to close the meal with something cool, sweet, and familiar. Children loved sneaking extra wafers, while adults traded stories over heaping spoonfuls. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers captured the heart of community gatherings in the 1970s, proving that the simplest combination of fruit, cream, and cookies could create a dessert experience that felt luxurious, comforting, and timeless all at once. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting brought. Cattail shoots were a food of hunger seasons, gathered from marshy ponds and swamps when the crops ran out. The young shoots, pale and tender near the base, could be eaten raw or boiled, tasting faintly of cucumber and corn. They grew where others saw only weeds, a secret supply of nourishment hidden in plain sight. Harvesting them meant wading into mud and cold water, cutting each stalk by hand. Cooked with salt or mixed into cornmeal cakes, they offered fiber, minerals, and hope. The cattail was generous. It provided roots for flour, leaves for weaving, and shoots for eating. Its abundance made it a silent ally to those who had little else. In the face of hunger, these swamp plants became a lifeline, a reminder that survival often grows quietly at the edge of hardship. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in Southern pantries today. Smoky collard greens with bacon drippings were a cherished side dish that married the earthy bitterness of collards with the deep, savory richness of rendered bacon fat. Slow cooked over hours, these greens absorbed the smoky flavor and fat from bacon drippings, elevating simple vegetables into something hearty and satisfying. The process usually involved simmering the greens with onions, garlic, and a splash of vinegar, which balanced the richness with a touch of acidity. This dish was a staple at Sunday dinners, family reunions, and holiday feasts, symbolizing comfort, community, and tradition. The use of bacon drippings reflected a time when cooks made every part of the animal count, honoring food without waste. Collard greens themselves are nutrient-dense, providing vitamins and minerals vital in diets during times when access to fresh produce was limited. Despite changes in dietary trends, smoky collard greens with bacon drippings remain a treasured recipe, though less commonly prepared today, offering a flavorful link to culinary heritage that is worth preserving. Blackberry cobbler without sugar proved that fruit's natural sweetness could create desserts when refined sugar wasn't available. Wild blackberries grew abundantly along fence lines and in abandoned fields, free for anyone willing to brave thorns and summer heat to pick them. Black families sent children out with buckets, returning with purple-stained hands and enough berries to make cobblers that lasted days. The berries were cooked down until their juices concentrated, natural sugars intensifying without any additions. Simple biscuit dough made from flour, lard, and buttermilk was dropped over the bubbling fruit, then baked until golden. The result was tart and intense, less sweet than modern desserts, but deeply satisfying in ways sugar-laden versions never achieve. These cobblers appeared at church socials and family gatherings, proof that celebration didn't require money. Women competed quietly over whose cobbler turned out best, pride coming from skill rather than expensive ingredients. The practice of picking wild berries taught children about seasons, patience, and finding abundance in nature with steadfast pride. Molasses jugs were a constant presence in many homes because molasses lasted for ages and sweetened everything from biscuits to porridge when sugar was too expensive to even think about buying. Dark, thick, and sticky, molasses had a way of turning basic flour and water into treats that lifted spirits during the bleakest days. Families used it in gingerbread, bread puddings, and even stirred into warm milk for a rare moment of sweetness. The jug lived at the back of the shelf, heavy and comforting, like a promise that dessert was still possible even in the hardest times. Grandmothers knew how far a single drizzle could go, stretching flavor with practiced hands. Molasses was Depression-era gold, affordable, lasting, and rich enough to make people forget how little they had. Dandelion green salad came straight from vacant lots and roadsides where free food grew abundantly if you knew what to look for. Black women taught their daughters which greens were safe to eat, passing down knowledge that connected them to African ancestors who had survived through intimate understanding of plants. Spring brought tender young dandelion leaves that were gathered in baskets before the plants flowered and turned bitter. These greens were washed repeatedly to remove grit, then torn by hand and dressed simply with vinegar, salt, and maybe a drizzle of bacon grease if available. The result was sharp, slightly bitter, and packed with vitamins that prevented scurvy during winter's lean months. In Chicago's South Side and Harlem's tenements, recent migrants foraged in any patch of green they could find, maintaining connections to rural foodways even in concrete jungles. Children were sent out with cloth bags to gather greens, learning to identify edible plants while contributing to family meals. Dandelion greens represented self-sufficiency and the refusal to go hungry when nature provided freely. Some families wilted the greens with hot bacon fat poured over top, creating a warm salad that felt more substantial through family wisdom. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, It was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself. And if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Canned tomatoes from summer harvests were one of the most valuable items in any pantry because tomatoes made meals stretch like nothing else. Families canned tomatoes in big batches, crushed, stewed, or whole, using whatever jars they had saved. When winter arrived, those jars became the base for soups, stews, gravies, and rice dishes that needed warmth and tang. The bright red color alone brought life into bleak kitchens. Grandmothers often rationed the jars, saving them for Sundays or meals that had to feed many mouths with very little. Canned tomatoes were not just food. They were security stored in glass, proof that hard work in the summer meant survival in the winter. Every jar opened carried the smell of warm sun and long days spent picking vines clean. Even when money was thin and meals were repetitive, tomatoes made dishes taste full, hearty, and comforting, becoming the quiet hero of countless Depression kitchens. Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. Fried peach. Hand pies were the portable sweets that filled church bazaars and summer block parties with the irresistible smell of hot pastry and fruit. Fresh peaches were simmered with sugar and a hint of cinnamon until they formed a thick golden filling. Circles of dough were spooned with the peach mixture, folded into half moons, and sealed with careful crimping. Each pie was fried until the crust blistered into a crisp golden shell, locking in the syrupy fruit. Children lined up for them, eager to hold the warm treats wrapped in paper towels that quickly soaked through with fragrant juices. Adults carried them home for late-night snacks or slipped them into lunchboxes for the next day. In the 1970s, these pies represented community and craftsmanship, transforming a seasonal fruit into a handheld dessert that needed no plate or fork. Fried peach hand pies brought a festival feeling to ordinary days, turning simple ingredients into something joyfully decadent and wonderfully portable. Blackberry dumplings turned backyard harvests into a dessert that captured the deep. Barley and rolled oats were affordable grains. Families stored in bulk to guarantee breakfast even on the leanest mornings. Both grains cooked slowly into thick, warm porridge that filled stomachs and kept families fueled through long days of work. A little sugar, syrup, or dried fruit transformed them into something comforting. For many, this was the meal that carried them through winter. Simple, steady, and dependable oats and barley reminded families that nourishment did not have to be fancy to be enough. Parents often served them before school or labor, knowing these bowls gave energy when strength was needed most. The smell of porridge simmering in the morning became a quiet reassurance that there would be something to eat today. Even when toppings were scarce, the warmth alone made the dish feel like kindness. Oats and barley were proof that survival could start with one humble bowl. Clay-baked fish is also something that's a bit unconventional because it doesn't really match up with anything we use today. It's a traditional cooking method that was used by several Native American tribes spread across the northern regions. A lot of places in North America were rich sources of fish, like the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Back then, preserving moisture was its own separate issue and struggle, and this was a particularly widespread way of doing that. This method would help the fish retain most of its moisture while also sealing in all kinds of natural flavors, and the end result was a much more exciting dish. Now, this works with most kinds of fish, so it's not like there's some strict preference. You should just roll with what you like. If you want to be historically accurate, then the Chinook and Haida tribes were pretty fond of using salmon. Some tribes also used trout or catfish, but the idea was to prepare the entire fish while also leaving the scales intact. Why would they do this? It was all to help the fish be baked properly. You didn't want anything messing up the meat on the inside. Now, some tribes were also fond of stuffing their fish, but if that's a little much, you don't have to go the extra mile. Rabbit and dumplings was the meal that turned a quiet woodland hunt into a hearty family supper, when store-bought meat was rare. Hunters brought back rabbits dressed and cleaned, and cooks simmered the lean meat slowly with onions, carrots, and herbs until it fell from the bone. Soft flour dumplings were dropped into the rich broth, swelling as they absorbed the savory flavor and thickened the stew. The dish fed large households through cold nights, stretching a single rabbit to satisfy many plates. Children learned to roll the dumpling dough while elders told stories of patient mornings in the woods and the respect owed to the animal that provided the meal. The aroma of simmering broth filled cabins and farm kitchens, promising comfort after long days of work. With modern markets providing endless options, few families still prepare rabbit in this old style. Yet those who recall the tender meat and pillowy dumplings speak of a warmth and gratitude that no packaged dinner can ever replace. Dried black-eyed peas were more than survival food. They were cultural tradition woven into daily life. Cheap, long-lasting, and nourishing, they filled big pots that fed entire families with little more than water and seasoning boiled slow. They softened into creamy, earthy comfort that tasted like memory and rooted identity. Elders told stories while stirring the pot, reminding everyone why these peas mattered and where the tradition came from. They showed up at New Year's for luck, at Sunday dinners for warmth, and through winter months for strength. Even when food was scarce, black-eyed peas brought a sense of ritual and belonging. Black-eyed peas were dependable, symbolic, and powerful in their simplicity. Their presence at the table connected generations, blending practicality and cultural pride. In many homes, the smell of simmering peas meant hope, a quiet assurance that even in hard times, tradition would carry families forward. The peas stretched across meals, offering steadiness when the world felt uncertain. They were survival, heritage, and nourishment, all cooked in the same pot. Stewed oxtails were once a humble dish, made from a cut of meat that required long, patient cooking to transform it into something tender and deeply flavorful. Slowly simmered with onions, garlic, and aromatic herbs, the oxtails released rich gelatin into the broth, creating a silky gravy that clung to every bite. Often served over rice, the dish was both filling and comforting, making it a favorite for Sunday dinners or cool weather meals. In African American kitchens, stewed oxtails represented a commitment to using every part of the animal and turning it into something extraordinary through time and care. The slow cooking process allowed families to gather and share stories while the aroma filled the home. Today, oxtails are far more expensive, and the tradition of simmering them from scratch has become less common, leaving behind a deep culinary legacy tied to resourcefulness and flavor. Crackling bread transformed pork scraps into cornbread so rich it could serve as a meal on its own. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard from pork fat, were considered waste by some but treasure by black cooks who understood their value. These crunchy, savory morsels were mixed directly into cornmeal batter, along with buttermilk, salt, and just enough flour to bind everything together. The batter was poured into smoking hot cast iron skillets, greased with lard, then baked until the bottom turned dark golden and crispy. Each bite delivered cornmeal's earthy sweetness, punctuated by bursts of porky crunch, creating textural contrasts that made plain bread feel special. In Mississippi, Delta communities, and rural Alabama, crackling bread appeared whenever hogs were slaughtered, ensuring every part of the animal fed someone. The bread was substantial enough to be breakfast, lunch, or dinner, often eaten with nothing but a glass of buttermilk or potlikker from greens. Children carried wedges of crackling bread in their pockets to school, the fat keeping them full through long days with resourceful hands. Cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality, tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times. Blackberry dumplings were a summer treat that celebrated the abundance of wild fruit. Blackberries, plucked fresh from brambles along fence lines and fields, were simmered with sugar until they released their juices and became a bubbling, fragrant sauce. Soft dumplings made from biscuit dough were dropped into the pot, absorbing the sweet berry flavor as they cooked. Served warm, often with a splash of cream or a scoop of ice cream, this dessert brought together the tartness of the berries and the comfort of tender dumplings. In African American rural communities, blackberry picking was often a family activity, with children and adults working together to gather enough fruit for pies, jams, and desserts like this. The dumplings stretched the berries into a more filling dish, ensuring everyone could have a generous portion. While store-bought berries are common today, the act of foraging for wild ones and making simple rustic desserts from them has largely disappeared, leaving blackberry dumplings as a delicious memory from a time when seasons shaped the table. Wild plum chutney offered a burst of tart sweetness when sugar was scarce and fruit trees grew untended along plantation edges. Gatherers picked the small, deeply colored plums at peak ripeness and simmered them slowly with a little honey or molasses when available, along with wild herbs for spice. The result was a tangy preserve that enlivened cornbread, salted meats, or simple porridge, providing vitamins and variety in otherwise plain meals. This method of combining fruit with savory seasonings echoed West African chutneys and relishes, demonstrating a culinary bridge between continents. After freedom, African American home cooks continued to prize wild plums for jellies and sauces, and many Southern families still make small-batch plum preserves each summer. The enduring appeal of wild plum chutney lies in its ability to turn overlooked fruit into a bright condiment that brightens any table. It stands as a flavorful link between survival cooking and the rich tapestry of modern Southern preserves that celebrate both heritage and the gifts of the wild landscape. The tropical brightness of crushed pineapple, creating a moist spice cake that delighted every gathering. Grated carrots added subtle texture, while cinnamon and nutmeg filled the kitchen with warm fragrance as the layers baked. Pineapple kept the crumb tender and infused each bite with a sunny tang. Once cooled, the cake was slathered with tangy cream cheese frosting, its smooth richness balancing the gentle spice beneath. Chopped pecans or walnuts sprinkled on top added crunch and a hint of earthiness, making every slice a celebration of flavor and contrast. In African American homes of the 1970s, carrot pineapple cake was a favorite for birthdays, church anniversaries, and Sunday dinners alike, admired for its balance of wholesome ingredients and decadent finish. Each piece felt generous and festive, a testament to the decades' love of bold flavors and abundant hospitality. This cake proved that vegetables and fruit together could create a dessert as indulgent as any chocolate confection. Sorghum syrup bottles sat on shelves like dark liquid treasure, thick, sweet, and impossible to waste. This syrup flavored biscuits drizzled over cornbread, stirred into porridges, and even served as a home remedy for sore throats or coughs. Sorghum lasted far longer than sugar and cost much less, making it a depression staple in African American homes. Kids loved dipping biscuits into the bottle's sticky mouth, and elders praised its strength for keeping people going when meals were bare. A single bottle could stretch across weeks, sweetening life in small but powerful ways. Sorghum syrup was flavor, medicine, and comfort wrapped into one. During winters when fruits were scarce and treats rare, sorghum made plain food feel indulgent. Its deep, earthy sweetness reminded families that even the simplest pantry items could bring warmth, energy, and a sense of steady, grounded survival. Many households kept it close at hand, using it sparingly but lovingly. Knowing that this humble syrup carried generations of tradition, sorghum was the kind of ingredient that hardened people against hunger and softened the edges of hard days, proving sweetness could survive even the toughest times. Pan-fried corn was sunshine in a skillet, sweet, buttery, and golden. Fresh ears were scraped by hand, milk and all, then tossed into hot bacon grease until the kernels popped and sizzled. A sprinkle of salt, a dash of sugar, maybe a touch of pepper. It didn't need much else. The smell filled the kitchen, calling everyone to gather round. Each spoonful had that mix of sweet and savory that only Southern cooks could master. It was summer food, made from corn grown nearby, cooked while the day was still hot and bright. You could eat it by itself or scoop it beside greens and meat, but it always stole the show. The sound of it frying was like music, a melody of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of dish that turned ordinary days into something to remember. Pan-fried corn was quick to make but impossible to forget, the kind of dish that reminded people that joy could fit inside a cast-iron skillet. Dried apples strung on twine were a frugal treat that tasted like sunshine saved for winter. Families sliced apples thin, threaded them onto cotton string, and hung them in warm, dry places until they shriveled into chewy, sweet slices. These dried apples could be eaten plain, tossed into oatmeal, or rehydrated into cobblers and pies when sugar was hard to come by. The flavor was intense, tart, sweet, and comforting all at once. Kids loved sneaking pieces straight from the string, and elders relied on them as a dependable snack during the harshest months. Dried apples were a reminder that even the simplest fruits could be preserved with patience and care. They captured the memory of fall harvests, carrying hints of orchard air into kitchens where fresh fruit had long disappeared. Families took pride in how long their apple strings lasted, measuring the success of the harvest by how many loops hung from rafters. Each slice represented work, foresight, and gratitude. Dried apples were more than food. They were edible memories that brightened even the bleakest winter days. Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that defined survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity. Dried marsh millet cakes were one of the oldest improvised cereals, born from wetland grains most people ignored. Marsh millet, a wild grass with tiny seeds, grew thick in the lowlands where other crops failed. Harvesting it took time and persistence, shaking stalks into baskets until enough was gathered. The grains were pounded with stones mixed with water and pressed into small cakes that were dried in the sun. The result was chewy and nutty, filling the belly when little else could. These cakes were tough but dependable, a meal that asked for effort but gave strength in return. Eaten alone or softened in broth, they kept workers moving through endless hours of labor. Their simple flavor carried the satisfaction of something earned, not given. Stored in cloth sacks, these cakes kept for weeks and could be soaked again in broth or milk when available. They were simple, resilient, and sustaining, food born entirely from observation and labor. In each bite was a blend of nature's generosity and human endurance, the kind of nourishment built quietly from effort rather than abundance, the taste of persistence itself. Dried fish from local creeks was a resource many African American families relied on when money could not stretch far enough for fresh meat. Fishermen salted the catch heavily, then hung it to dry in smoke or sun, creating a protein that lasted weeks without refrigeration. This fish was rehydrated in stews, fried in small pieces, or flaked into hash with potatoes. It smelled strong but tasted rich, filling the role of meat when meat simply was not an option. Drying fish required time, patience, and knowledge passed between generations. It was a tradition born from necessity and shaped by the environment. Families guarded these pieces carefully, knowing each strip could anchor multiple meals. When pots simmered with dried fish, the aroma meant dinner would be satisfying, even if ingredients were simple. It was survival shaped by water, fire, salt, and skill. That fish represented self-reliance, something pulled from nature, transformed by human hands, and stretched to nourish as many mouths as possible. Kids watched their elders clean, salt, and hang the fish, learning not just a recipe but a way of life built on resourcefulness. Dried fish was more than food. It was a lesson in endurance, pride, and making the most of what the world offered. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Showstopper of warm weather socials, a snowy white vision that cooled the hottest summer evenings. A light sponge cake baked in a large rectangular pan provided the base, while a creamy coconut frosting made with evaporated milk and sweetened shredded coconut blanketed the top like fresh snow. After chilling, the cake absorbed the frosting's rich flavor, turning each bite into a tender tropical treat. Served in generous squares at backyard picnics or family reunions, it delivered sweetness without heaviness, perfect after barbecue or spicy foods. Guests admired the way the coconut caught the light, sparkling like tiny crystals as the cake was sliced. In African American households of the 1970s, coconut sheet cake became a seasonal favorite that signaled celebration and hospitality. Its simplicity and ability to feed a crowd made it a practical choice, while its striking appearance ensured it was remembered long after the last square disappeared from the platter. Lemon chess pie shone with bright cracklings collected after rendering pork were tiny pieces of concentrated flavor families treated like treasure. When a pig was butchered, every scrap mattered, and the fat was slowly rendered down to make lard, a kitchen essential. What floated to the top and hardened into crisp little bits were the cracklings. Families saved them in tins, sprinkling them into cornbread, greens, or potatoes to stretch flavor when real meat was too expensive to buy. Kids snacked on them warm, crunching down on something salty and rich enough to feel like a luxury. Cracklings reminded families that nothing should ever be wasted. They turned ordinary dishes into something satisfying, giving food depth even when ingredients were scarce. During the Depression, Those little pieces of pork kept meals from tasting empty, carrying the weight of both flavor and tradition. They also became a quiet symbol of gratitude, proof that even the smallest leftovers could bring a burst of joy into kitchens that rarely saw abundance. Elders treated cracklings with respect, storing them carefully, as if they were worth far more than they cost. And in many ways, they were cracklings connected families to the land, the animal, and the knowledge that survival depended on using every last thing with intention. Batter-fried catfish was a highlight of Southern fish fries, where friends and family gathered for food, music, and conversation. Fresh-caught catfish from rivers or ponds were cleaned, filleted, and coated in a seasoned cornmeal batter before being dropped into hot oil. The result was a golden, crispy crust giving way to tender, mild-tasting fish. Often served with coleslaw, hush puppies, and tartar sauce, it was a meal that celebrated both the bounty of local waters and the joy of community. In African American culture, fish fries were more than a way to eat. They were social events that strengthened ties and offered a space for laughter and storytelling. Batter-fried catfish was a centerpiece of these gatherings, appreciated for its satisfying crunch and comforting flavor. While farm-raised catfish has made the fish more widely available, the traditional preparation and community-centered events around it have become less frequent. For those who experienced them, the memory of hot, crispy catfish eaten outdoors among friends remains a cherished part of culinary history. Persimmon leather was a sweetness born from scarcity, made when sugar was a dream too far from reach. Wild persimmons, soft and golden when ripe, were gathered by hand and mashed into pulp, their tartness fading into deep honeyed flavor as they dried under the southern sun. Spread thin on boards or cloth, the pulp hardened into chewy sheets that could last for months, folded and stored for the hard winter ahead. It was candy made by patience, nutrition pressed into a form that would not spoil. The process itself was quiet work, often done at the edges of daylight, each batch a small defiance against hunger. When the cold arrived and food was scarce, a strip of persimmon leather could lift spirits and soothe hunger's edge. In its sweetness lived a lesson. Survival does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes it tastes like sunlight caught in fruit. Home-smoked meats hung for later use were the closest thing many families had to long-term protein storage. Even the smallest cuts, ham hocks, neck bones, tails, were smoked in backyard setups or community smokehouses until they held enough flavor to season countless meals. These smoked pieces were not eaten all at once. Instead, they were simmered in pots of beans, greens, or cabbage, stretching flavor across many days. The scent of smoke meant security, a reminder that even if fresh meat was rare, there was still something to fall back on. Families checked on the hanging pieces regularly, protecting them from animals and weather. Those smoked meats were survival anchors, carrying households through the longest, leanest weeks. Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fatback if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them. During the Depression, evaporated milk was more than a convenience. It was survival disguised as luxury. It allowed families to recreate dishes they remembered from better times, even when money was scarce and ingredients were limited. Its shelf life made it a pantry staple that brought comfort through winter storms, long work days, and nights when meals needed something special. In many homes, evaporated milk was the ingredient that made food feel complete, turning simple meals into something worth gathering around. Sweet potato pie without sugar became an ingenious solution when refined sugar cost more than most families could afford. Black cooks relied on the sweet potatoes' natural sugars, roasting them until their starches converted to sweetness that rivaled any added sugar. The potatoes were mashed smooth, then mixed with a little flour, whatever milk or buttermilk could be spared, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin held any. This mixture was poured into simple pastry crusts made from lard and flour, then baked until set. The result wasn't as sweet as modern pies, but it carried deep, earthy flavors that spoke of autumn harvests and survival through winter. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens, storing well in root cellars for months after harvest. Families who grew their own could make pies throughout fall and winter, stretching one crop across countless meals. In Black communities, sweet potato pie represented celebration despite poverty, proof that special occasions deserved recognition even when money was absent. Children looked forward to these pies as rare treats, savoring every bite of something that felt luxurious despite humble ingredients through shared sacrifice. Which cheap meal from your mother's kitchen do you miss the most? Share your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep honoring these resourceful traditions together.